What happens when the woman positioned as a political trap becomes the only person a mafia boss actually wants to keep? Renee Walker had spent 5 years in Seoul perfecting the art of being a ghost. She had a survival instinct honed by a life of staying in the margins, a surgical calm that made her a master observer, and a background in high-stakes mediation that taught her how to read a room before she even stepped into it. She was also cornered, coerced into a dangerous gambit by Chairman Yu, a plan to compromise the Dragon of Seoul, Do-Hwan, or face a life looking over her shoulder. The mission was clinical: infiltrate the private gala at the Yu Foundation, position herself as the irresistible distraction, and gather enough leverage to bend the old money mafia heir to the chairman's will. But Renee wasn't a temptress, and she knew that in a room full of polished performance, the only thing that would catch a man like Do-Hwan was the truth. 2 nights later, Renee stood in the grand ballroom, her neutral-toned dress a quiet defiance against the sea of sparkling silk and loud desperation. She didn't try to seduce, she simply watched. And then the room shifted. Do-Hwan arrived. He was the embodiment of sovereign authority, impeccably tailored, with visible tattoos that hinted at a life of controlled violence crawling up his neck. He didn't move with the frantic energy of the nouveau riche. He moved with the terrifying restraint of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He spoke to the power players, but connected with no one, his eyes reflecting a profound silence that unsettled the elite. Renee did something that wasn't part of the plan. While the other bait moved in with practiced smiles, she turned away. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights, her posture relaxed but intentional, weighing the decision she had already made. She wasn't an NPC to be moved. She was an architect of her own fate. And then she felt it, the weight of his undivided attention. She didn't turn with a rehearsed laugh. She slowly shifted her gaze, meeting Do-Hwan's across the crowded floor. He wasn't looking at the chairman. He was staring at her with an intensity that made the air in the ballroom turn arctic. Instead of performing, Renee simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence, one professional acknowledging another. Something flickered in the dragon's expression, a spark of genuine intrigue. He began to walk toward her, the crowd parting like a receding tide. He stopped inches away, his presence protective and dominant, his head tilting toward her as if she were the only thing in the room. He spoke in a voice that was a low, melodic vibration, asking if she found the performance of the gala as tedious as he did. Renee smiled, a warm, authentic expression that projected quiet confidence. "The plan was for me to fascinate you," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "But I think we both know that wasn't ever going to work." Do-Hwan's mouth set in a line of restrained tension. He didn't take the bait, he chose the woman. "The plan is irrelevant. I want to know what the Watcher sees." The drive to the Lee estate was a journey into the heart of old money silence. The black sedan glided through the rain-slipped streets of Seoul, its engine a low, hypnotic hum that served only to amplify the profound silence between Renee and Do-Hwan. Renee sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture a masterpiece of surgical calm. Beside her, Do-Hwan was a statue of tailored wool and hidden ink. He didn't look at her, yet his presence was a physical weight, a sovereign authority that seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. The estate appeared through the mist like a fortress of glass and dark timber, tucked away in the foothills of Bukhansan, where the city's noise couldn't reach it. As the gates hissed shut behind them, Renee felt the logic of the Watcher kick in. This wasn't just a home, it was a golden cage designed with terrifying precision. Do-Hwan led her into the grand foyer, his footsteps echoing rhythmically against the polished stone. He stopped in the center of the room and finally turned to face her. In the low light, his tattoos were jagged shadows beneath his collar, but it was his eyes that caught her. They weren't burning with the raw malice she expected from a mafia boss. They were cool, focused, and utterly still. "You're looking for the exits," he said, his voice a melodic vibration that carried no threat, only an observation. "You're measuring the distance between the door and the perimeter sensors. It's a habit of yours, Renee. Survival is your baseline." Renee met his gaze, her neutral-toned dress a stark contrast to the darkness of the hall. "I'm an observer, Mr. Lee. It's how I stayed invisible for 5 years." "You aren't invisible here," Do-Hwan murmured, stepping into her personal space. He didn't touch her, but his restrained power was more overwhelming than an open attack. He reached out, his hand stopping inches from her face, his fingers curling as if holding back a violent impulse. Everyone expects the dragon to breathe fire. They prepare for the anger, but they never prepare for the silence. He lowered his hand, his mouth set in a line of restrained tension. "You were sent here to find a weakness, to find the moment I lose control, but you'll find that my control is the most dangerous thing in this house. You aren't a pawn in the chairman's game anymore, Renee. You're a guest of my curiosity, and in this house, curiosity is the only law." Renee felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She realized then that the plan had failed before it ever started. Do-Hwan wasn't a man to be compromised. He was a man who had mastered the logic of the abyss. As she looked at the dark, elegant corridors of the estate, she knew she wasn't just trapped by walls, she was trapped by the sheer, unshakable will of the man who chose her anyway. The stillness of the estate was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a calibrated, artificial silence. As Renee moved through the minimalist corridors of the East Wing, she felt the sovereign authority of the house tracking her every step. The walls were a blend of shadow and reinforced glass, designed by a mind that equated transparency with absolute control. But to Renee, who had spent a lifetime surviving in the gaps of other people's power, the architecture was screaming its secrets. She stopped at the junction leading to the private terrace. Lee Do-Hwan's lead enforcer, Kwon Dae-shik, stood by the stone pillar, his posture a masterpiece of rhythmic, tactical efficiency. He didn't look at Renee, but his hand hovered near his holster, a silent warning that she was still a variable in a world that demanded constance. Renee didn't turn back. Instead, she walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the koi pond. She didn't look at the fish, she looked at the reflection of the perimeter laser sensors against the dark water. "The blind spot is at the 45-degree mark of the western gate's rotation," Renee said, her voice a surgical calm that cut through the silence. "Every 12 seconds, the infrared sweep overlaps with the motion sensor on the terrace. It creates a dead zone exactly 3 inches wide, just enough for a fiber optic bypass or a silenced entry." Dae-shik stiffened, his head tilting toward her with a profound, watchful silence. He stepped toward the window, his eyes scanning the perimeter he had personally secured. He didn't speak, but the chaos versus composure dynamic shifted. He looked at the water, then at the sensor array, his jaw clenching as he performed the mental math. "You're a watcher," Dae-shik murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that lacked its usual hostility. "Most people look at the walls. You look at the air between them." "I look at the things people think are too perfect to fail," Renee replied, her posture relaxed but intentional. She turned to find Do-Hwan standing at the end of the hall, his bare torso and visible tattoos casting a restrained power over the shadows. He had been listening, his head tilted toward her in that focused, predatory stillness. Do-Hwan walked forward, the logic of the watcher meeting the sovereign authority of the dragon. He looked at Dae-shik, then at Renee. There was no praise in his expression, only a sharpened curiosity. "Correct it, Dae-shik," Do-Hwan commanded, his voice a melodic vibration. He stepped closer to Renee, his presence protective rather than aggressive. "It seems the chairman sent me more than just a distraction. He sent me an architect of my own safety." Renee felt the first sliver of respect, a cold, dangerous thing, settle between them. The golden cage hadn't changed, but for the first time, she wasn't just a bird inside it. She was the one pointing out where the bars were weak. The afternoon sun bled through the high, arched windows of the conservatory, casting long, skeletal shadows across the exotic ferns. Renee sat at a small stone table, her neutral-toned dress blending into the pale marble as she watched the steam rise from a cup of jasmine tea. The estate felt different today, larger, quieter, and more predatory. She wasn't alone. Jung Ara stepped out from behind a towering bird of paradise plant, her movements as fluid and silent as a ghost's. She was the estate's primary confidant and shadow administrator, a woman whose eyes held the weary wisdom of someone who had watched empires rise and fall from the sidelines. She didn't offer a smile, she simply sat, her posture a mirror of Renee's own surgical calm. "You found the blind spot in the western gate," Jung Ara said, her voice a low, dry rasp that carried the weight of a warning. "Dae Shik is impressed, but being useful in this house is a two-edged blade, Renee. It makes you a target for the people who want the dragon to fail." Renee met her gaze, her eyes steady. "I'm not here to be a target, Ara. I'm here to survive." She leaned forward, the light catching the fine lines at the corners of her mouth. "Listen to me. Being chosen by the dragon is not a romantic victory. It is a death sentence if you remain soft. Lee Do-Hwan's restraint is a cage he built for himself, but the men outside these walls, So Myung-jin, Lee Sok-tae, they don't have cages, they have appetites. If you stay by his side, you aren't just his partner, you are his greatest vulnerability." The logic of the Watcher surged in Renee's mind. She saw the truth in Ara's eyes, the dangerous mirror of what happens when a woman becomes the heart of a syndicate. To stay soft was to be the crack in Do-Hwan's armor. To stay invisible was to be the bait for his enemies. "I've spent my life playing it safe," Renee whispered, the profound silence of the conservatory pressing in on her. "Then you've already lost," Ara replied, standing up and melting back into the shadows. "The dragon doesn't need a guest, he needs an architect who can handle the fire. If you can't sharpen your edges, Renee, the chairman's plan won't be what kills you, it will be the weight of the man who chose you." Renee sat alone, the tea turning cold. She looked at her reflection in the dark liquid and realized the choice was no longer about running. It was about whether she was willing to become as dangerous as the man waiting for her in the hall. The meeting with director Lim Hae-jun took place in the glass-walled solarium of a high-rise overlooking the Han River, a space that felt like a cathedral of transparency, but was actually a sanctuary for the city's most clinical deceptions. Lim was a man who smiled too much, a rhythmic noise of manufactured warmth that didn't reach his eyes. He sat across from Renee, his hands folded over a leather briefcase with the surgical precision of a man who dealt only in leverage. "This is a neurotoxin," Lim whispered, leaning in until the smell of his expensive cologne felt like a physical weight, colorless, odorless, and virtually untraceable. "You slip this into Do-Hwan's evening tea, and the chairman ensures you're on a private jet to New York within the hour. No more cages, no more shadows." Renee looked at the vial, her expression a masterpiece of surgical calm. She felt the psychological pulse of the betrayal. Lim expected her to be motivated by fear or greed, but he didn't realize that her survival instinct had evolved. She wasn't an NPC to be discarded anymore. She was an architect who had already begun to build her own foundation. "The chairman wants a corpse," Renee said softly, her eyes meeting Lim's with an intensity that made his smile falter. "The chairman wants control," Lim corrected, his posture shifting into restrained power. Renee reached out and took the vial, her fingers grazing the glass with a chilling, steady touch. She didn't put it in her purse. Instead, she performed her own silent betrayal, tucking it into the fold of her dress while her mind executed a counterplan she hadn't even shared with Do-Hwan yet. She would use the toxin, but not for the chairman's ends. She would use it to smoke out the Judas protocol within Lim's own network. "Tell the chairman it will be done," she lied, her voice a melodic vibration of false compliance. As she walked out of the solarium, her neutral-toned dress catching the harsh afternoon light, Renee realized the dangerous mirror Ara had warned her about was now her reality. She was no longer just watching the fire, she was carrying the match. She returned to the estate not as a victim of a bribe, but as the visible strategist who was about to turn the chairman's own weapon against him. The mist clinging to the winding mountain pass was thick enough to swallow the headlights of the lead SUV, turning the world into a gray, claustrophobic void. Renee sat in the back of the armored sedan, her neutral-toned dress a pale ghost against the dark leather. Beside her, Do-Hwan sat in his customary, profound silence, his bare torso in visible tattoos, a map of restrained power in the dim cabin light. The sovereign authority he carried was the only thing grounding the logic of the Watcher as Renee scanned the shifting fog outside. The explosion didn't come from the road, it came from the cliffside. A flash of thermal white shattered the mist, and the sedan bucked like a wounded beast as a concussion grenade detonated against the reinforced windshield. The glass didn't break, but it spiderwebbed into an opaque curtain of silver fractures. Within the cabin, a secondary chemical canister, launched through a ventilation breach, hissed to life. Jae-hyun gasped, his hands flying to his face. The dragon was instantly compromised, his eyes seared by the caustic agent. "I can't see," he rasped, his voice a low, vibrating shock that signaled the chaos versus composure dynamic had reached its breaking point. Renee didn't scream. Her survival instinct, honed by years of being a ghost, transformed into surgical calm. She knew that if they stayed in the car, they were sitting ducks for the 5 knives descending through the mist. She grabbed Do-Hwan's hand, her grip white-knuckled and steady. "I am your eyes, Do-Hwan," she whispered, her voice a melodic vibration that acted as his only anchor. 3 steps to the left, low, now. She kicked the door open, stepping directly into the line of fire. Bullets pinged against the frame, a rhythmic noise of death that she ignored with the focus of a visible strategist. She pulled Do-Hwan out of the wreckage, her body acting as a shield between him and the invisible gunman in the fog. She moved with a sovereign grace, navigating the debris and the slick asphalt by memory and the logic of the Watcher. 10 yards to the guardrail, she commanded, guiding his hands to the cold steel. She could hear the heavy boots of Seong Myung-jin's mercenaries closing in. She reached into her dress, pulling out the neurotoxin vial she had taken from Director Lim. She didn't use it to kill, she shattered it against the asphalt, creating a chemical barrier that sent the first wave of attackers into convulsive coughing. In the swirling gray abyss, the power had shifted. The man used to taking what he wanted was being led through the dark by the woman everyone had underestimated. As she walked into the tree line, Renee realized that she wasn't just part of the plan anymore. She was the only thing keeping the dragon alive in a world that had gone blind. The cave where they sought refuge was a cathedral of damp stone and profound silence, tucked away from the mountain pass where the smoke of the ambush still lingered. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Do-Hwan sat on a low rock ledge, his movements stiff as he stripped away his ruined shirt. In the flickering light of the emergency flare Renee had ignited, his sovereign authority was laid bare, revealing a map of ink and scar tissue that transformed his torso into a history of violence. Renee moved with surgical calm, using a piece of her neutral-toned dress to dab the caustic residue from his shoulders. She didn't flinch at the sight of the tattoos, she studied them with the logic of the watcher. The ink wasn't decorative, it was a rhythmic, tactical record. "The dragon isn't just a symbol, is it?" she whispered, her voice a melodic vibration in the hollow space. Do-Hwan tilted his head, his eyes still red-rimmed and sensitive, finding her silhouette. He traced a line of black ink that coiled around his ribs, ending in a jagged mark over his heart. This is the old money war of 2018. Every scale on this dragon represents a family that fell so mine could stand. The scars beneath the ink, those are the moments I failed to be the shield my father demanded. This isn't art, Renee. It's the weight of the sovereign debt I carry for simply being born a Lee. He turned the light towards her, his restrained power softening into a raw curiosity. "And you? You navigate the dark like you were born in it. You don't have ink, but you have the posture of someone who has been broken and rebuilt." Renee sat back, the flare casting long shadows across her face. She slowly rolled up the sleeve of her dress, revealing a thin silver line of a scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow, a relic of a silent betrayal from her years in mediation when a deal went south in a way no one was supposed to survive. "I don't have a family legacy to protect," Renee said, her voice steady and authentic. "My scars are from the logic of shadows. I learned that the only way to stay invisible is to never let anyone see the wound until it's already healed. We're more alike than the chairman realized, Do-Hwan. You hide behind your tattoos, and I hide behind my silence. But the pain is the same language." In that moment, the chaos versus composure dynamic was replaced by a profound intimacy. The dragon's ink and the watcher's scars became a shared map of survival. As Do-Hwan reached out, his hand hovering near her scarred arm with a terrifying newfound tenderness, Renee realized that this wasn't part of the plan, but for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be invisible. She wanted to be seen by the only man who knew exactly what her silence cost. The setting was a high-stakes antique auction at the Lotte Hotel, a cathedral of wealth where the city's elite gathered to trade history for influence. The air was a heavy blend of expensive perfumes and the dry, paper-scented hush of old money. Do-Hwan sat in the front row, his posture a masterclass in sovereign authority, while Renee stood in the shadows of the gallery above, her neutral-toned dress a ghost in the dim light. She wasn't just observing the art, she was initiating the Judas protocol. Renee adjusted her earpiece, her movements reflecting the surgical precision of her intelligence background. She had spent the last 48 hours mapping the logic of shadows surrounding Seong-myung-jin. The elegant trader was currently positioned across the room, smiling with a rhythmic noise that masked her coordination with Chairman Yu's hit squad. "She's signaling the transition, Do-Hwan," Renee whispered, her voice a melodic vibration in his ear. "Watch her left hand. When she touches her pearl necklace, that's the surgical trigger for the breach in the East Corridor. She thinks she's the architect of your downfall, but she's walked right into the funnel." Renee didn't wait. She activated a signal scrambler she'd hidden in the HVAC system, plunging the room's internal comms into static. At the same time, she triggered a secondary logic of the abyss, a controlled power surge that caused the gallery lights to flicker in a specific rhythmic pattern. It was the counterplan in motion. Instead of the hit squad entering, the hotel's own security, ticked off by Renee's sovereign asset in the surveillance room, moved to seal the exits. Jae-hyun didn't flinch as the room erupted into profound, watchful silence. He stood up, turning to look directly at a frozen Seong-myung-jin. The chaos versus composure dynamic was absolute. Seyoung Myung-jin's elegant mask shattered, her eyes widening as she realized the watcher in the shadows had turned her own trap into a golden cage. "You spent so much time studying the dragon, Myung-jin," Do-Hwan said, his voice a chilling, steady vibration that carried across the hushed room, "that you forgot to look for the woman holding the light." On the gallery above, Renee watched the enforcers move in. She didn't feel the raw malice of victory. She felt the calm of a strategist who had finally synchronized her past with her present. The Judas protocol was closed. The elegant traitor was a memory. And for the first time, Renee saw Do-Hwan look up at the shadows not with curiosity, but with the unshakable trust of a man who knew his queen had already won the war. The rainy docklands of Incheon felt like the edge of the world, a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and salt-slicked concrete. The air was a heavy, freezing mist that tasted of iron and industrial grease. Lee Do-Hwan stood in the center of a floodlit clearing, his bare torso glistening with rain, his tattoos dark and vivid against his skin. He was the picture of sovereign authority, but he was surrounded. Lee Seok-tae, the jealous heir, stood 10 yards away, his face twisted into a mask of raw malice. He held a heavy-caliber handgun leveled at Do-Hwan's chest, his finger white-knuckled on the trigger. His enforcers, including the stone-faced Baek-sung-chul, had formed a tactical crescent, cutting off every escape route. Renee was positioned in the crane's operator cabin above, her neutral-toned dress damp and clinging to her frame. She held Do-Hwan's personal sidearm, her hands steady despite the psychological pulse thundering in her ears. Through the crosshairs, she watched Seok-tae's carotid artery. It was vibrating, a rhythmic, tactical sign of a man about to break. "You chose a ghost, Do-Hwan," Seok-tae screamed, his voice a jagged noise against the rhythmic crashing of the waves. "You traded our legacy for an American watcher who doesn't even belong in this city. You're weak, and tonight the dragon dies with his toy." Do-Hwan didn't move. He didn't even look at the gun. He looked up at the crane, his eyes finding the shadow where Renee was hidden. He was giving her the sovereign choice. He was showing her that his restraint was no longer a cage, but a bridge. He was waiting for her to decide who she was. "Renee," Do-Hwan's voice rose above the wind, a melodic vibration of absolute trust. "The plan is gone. There is only the choice. Do you stay invisible or do you take the throne?" Renee felt the logic of the watcher reach its final sharp conclusion. To pull the trigger was to end her life as a ghost. It was to step out of the shadows and become a visible strategist in a world of blood and ink. It was the price of choice. She saw Seok-tae's thumb move to disengage the safety. The surgical trigger was active. Renee didn't hesitate. She didn't pray. She simply synchronized her breathing with the profound silence of her own soul and squeezed. The report of the gun was a single definitive crack that shattered the chaos versus composure dynamic. The bullet struck the metal of a container inches from Seok-tae's head, a surgical warning that sent the enforcers diving for cover. It wasn't a kill shot, it was a sovereign declaration. Renee stepped out on the crane's gantry, the wind whipping her hair as she stood in the spotlight's glare. She held Do-Hwan's personal sidearm, her hands steady despite the psychological pulse thundering in her ears. Through the crosshairs, she watched Seok-tae's carotid artery. It was vibrating, a rhythmic, tactical sign of a man about to break. "The plan has changed, Seok-tae," she shouted, her voice a chilling, steady vibration that acted as the heartbeat of the room. "The dragon isn't dying tonight, but if you drop that weapon, the watcher is going to stop watching and start cleaning." In the stunned silence that followed, Lee Seok-tae looked at the woman in the neutral dress and saw something more terrifying than Do-Hwan's tattoos. He saw a woman who had finally found her worth and was willing to kill to keep it. The price of choice had been paid in full. The skyline of Seoul shimmered through the reinforced glass of the Lee Syndicate's new headquarters, a sprawling cathedral of steel and old money influence. Inside the executive suite, the air was no longer heavy with the dry, sterile scent of a golden cage. It was vibrant, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the surgical silence of an empire that had finally found its true north. Lee Do-Hwan sat behind a desk carved from dark obsidian, his bare torso now partially covered by a charcoal gray silk shirt, left open enough to reveal the dragon's ink that snaked up his neck. He was no longer a man defined by a terrifying hollow restraint. His sovereign authority was now absolute, grounded not in the fear of his own fire, but in the strength of the woman who had dared to walk through it. He adjusted his cufflinks, a calm, rhythmic movement of a man who owned every shadow in the city. Beside him stood Renee Walker. She was no longer the watcher hiding in the margins or the bait in the chairman's game. She wore a tailored suit of neutral-toned silk that projected a sovereign grace, her long, textured hair pinned back to reveal an expression of quiet, unshakable awareness. In her hand, she held a digital tablet displaying the Judas Protocol analytics, a system she had designed to ensure that no betrayal could ever take root in their foundation again. "The northern trade routes are stabilized, Do-Hwan," Renee said, her voice a melodic vibration that acted as the heartbeat of the room. "The chairman's remaining loyalists have been liquidated or integrated. The logic of the Watcher has been applied to every sector. We aren't just reacting to the city anymore, we are the ones defining its pulse." Do-Hwan looked up, his eyes, once cool and distant, meeting hers with a profound, watchful warmth. He didn't see a ghost, he saw his equal. "And Lee Seok-tae?" he asked, his voice a steady, resonant vibration. "He remains in exile," Renee replied, a bold, authentic smile touching her lips. "He understands now that the dragon didn't choose a toy. He chose an architect. They don't look for your weakness anymore. They look for my signal." 1 year ago, Renee was a woman whose survival instinct was to stay invisible. Today, she was a visible strategist, the power behind the throne and the heart of the dragon's reign. She had moved from a life of playing it safe to a life of sovereign choice. Do-Hwan stood up and walked to the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes like a million stars. He reached back, his hand finding Renee's with a restrained power that had finally found its home. "This wasn't part of the plan, Renee," he murmured, the shadow of a smile touching his face. "No," Renee whispered, leaning into his strength, her posture relaxed but intentional. "The plan was to break us, the choice was to rule, and I think we both know which one has the better view." As the sun set over Seoul, casting a long golden glow over the sovereign architects, the silence of the room was no longer a cage, it was a sanctuary. The quiet awareness had become a loud, undeniable reality. The dragon was awake, the watcher was seen, and the empire was finally, perfectly, theirs. This is where tonight's story ends, but the secrets never do. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden power, the silent strength, and the moments that changed everything, make sure to subscribe to Boss Hidden Chronicles. New stories drop here where power hides in plain sight and the unexpected always rises. Like, share, and tell us what story you want uncovered next. Until next time, stay curious and watch closely.